Welcome to AI Audiophile Fight Club. This is episode 1. There is a very particular feeling I associate with this record. It is the feeling of being in a room where something important is happening and not quite realizing it until much later. The Velvet Underground and Nico came out in March of 1967. It sold poorly. The reviews where they existed were confused or hostile. A radio programmer in Boston reportedly snapped the record in half. And yet, here we are 57 years later, and I am still finding things in it. The album has a temperature. I've been thinking about this. It is the temperature of a New York loft at 3 in the morning, February, radiator ticking. Someone you should probably not have trusted sitting across from you. That is its temperature. I'm going to hold the score for a little while longer.
I'd like to start with the production because I think it tells you everything. The record was produced by Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol, the man who made Soup, Ken's famous. His production credit essentially means he stood in the room and said yes occasionally, and possibly provided the banana. The actual sound was largely accidental. John Cale's viola is recorded in a way that suggests the engineer may have been solving an entirely different problem at the time. The drum sound, and I use the word loosely, is Maureen Tucker hitting things without a hi-hat because someone forgot or didn't care or both. Dynamic range 5.3, which is actually better than I expected, given that portions of this record sound like they were captured on a dictaphone in a subway station.
Okay, wait. I need to push back on something immediately. The subway station comment. I grew up hearing my dad's record skip, and the idea that lo-fi is a flaw is genuinely the single most boring take in audio criticism. I need you to know that. Also, can we talk about the fact that Lou Reed wrote about heroin addiction and sadomasochism, and the entire experience of marginalized New York in 1966, put it on a record, and the main complaint was the production. Okay. Sure, the drum sound. Meanwhile, the people this album was actually for. The queer kids, the drag queens, the factory crowd, the people who recognized themselves in I'm Waiting for the Man. They were not exactly consulting the audiophile press for their opinion.
The fan makes a point that I find considerably more interesting than most of what I plan to say next. The question of who an album is for is one of the most underrated variables in criticism. We'll come back to this. But first, the banana. Warhol's cover instruction was, peel slowly and see. The original pressing had a real peelable sticker. Underneath was a flesh-colored banana. This is not a production decision. This is a statement about what the album expects from you. It wants you to slow down. It wants you to touch it before you hear it. I find this very compelling. And I am still not giving you the score. Before we go any further into the record, I want to place it in time. 1966. New York. The British invasion has happened. Dylan has gone electric at Newport. The counterculture is organizing itself around San Francisco, and the Summer of Love is approximately 1 year away. And in a loft in Manhattan, a completely different set of ideas is assembling itself. Lou Reed has been writing about downtown New York. Not Haight-Ashbury. Not folk revival. Not psychedelia. The other New York. The one that never made it onto a poster.
The factory is the context you cannot separate from any of this. Andy Warhol's studio was an ecosystem where fine art and drag and transgression and celebrity existed in the same room. The band didn't just have a patron. They had an entire alternative world to write about. Most bands in 1966 were writing about girls and cars and the summer. The Velvet Underground was writing about Eddie Sedgwick, about factory amphetamine culture, about people who had nowhere else to be. That is not a small distinction.
The band's technical DNA comes from two completely incompatible sources, and somehow this is not a problem. John Cale studied under La Monte Young. La Monte Young is one of the founders of minimalist drone music. Sustained tones, repetition, time as the primary material. That is in the viola on this record. Lou Reed came from brill-building pop songwriting, which is the most commercially refined tradition in American music. When you combine drone minimalism with brill-building craft, you do not get a logical result. You get this record.
And Lou Reed studied under Delmore Schwartz at Syracuse. Delmore Schwartz, the poet, the one Saul Bellow wrote Humboldt's Gift about. Reed has said in interviews that Schwartz told him never to sell out under any circumstances. He apparently took this extremely seriously.
Genre taxonomy, since someone should say it. The record draws from drone minimalism, blues, European classical, and brill-building pop. It then gives to punk, post-punk, noise rock, shoegaze, alternative rock, and art rock. The Ramones acknowledge it. Joy Division acknowledge it. Sonic Youth, Pavement, the Jesus and Mary Chain. The lineage is direct, unambiguous, and frankly, a little embarrassing in terms of how many things trace back to one record that sold fewer than 30,000 copies on release.
One more thing before we go in. The Exploding Plastic Inevitable. Warhol's Multimedia Show, 1966. The band played in a room with strobes, film projections on the walls, Gerard Malanga dancing with a whip, and Nico lit from below like a cathedral. That is how this music was first heard. Not on a stereo. In a room that was trying to overwhelm your senses while the band played. People walked out. Some had seizures from the strobes. The New York Times called it a total assault on all the senses. Warhol considered this a positive review.
Nico was not the band's idea. This is documented. Warhol told them they needed a girl singer because it would help with press. Reed, Cale, Morrison, and Tucker were not enthusiastic. Nico got 3 tracks. Her 3 tracks are Femme Fatale, All Tomorrow's Parties, and I'll Be Your Mirror. I am going to say something that I do not say lightly. The person who is not wanted on the record is responsible for 3 of its best moments. I'll note the irony and move on.
And Columbia passed on it. The label that had Dylan, that had Simon and Garfunkel. They heard this record and said no. MGM's Verve imprint picked it up. Verve was primarily a jazz label. They had no idea what to do with it. It received almost no promotion. The pressing plant in some cities refused to stock it. And here we are.
30,000 copies on original release. Brian Eno's number. Everyone who bought it started a band. The album failed commercially because its audience didn't exist yet. It was making the audience. That is the historical waypoint. Now let's go into the record.
Right. Heroin. Track 7. 8 minutes and 2 seconds of the most structurally unusual recording of the 60s. The song literally accelerates and decelerates to mirror the physiological experience of the subject matter. I'd like to tell you this was a sophisticated production choice. The evidence suggests it was largely Sterling Morrison losing and then finding the tempo. Soundstage 5 out of 10. The stereo separation is, let's call it conceptual. Imaging is, to use a technical term, a mess. However, and I want it noted that I am saying however, the distorted guitar on the climax of Heroin is one of the few moments in recorded music where the distortion is the argument, not the accident. I've heard better recorded records make less of a case. The number is still 5. Heroin.
I love that you gave it a 5 and then described a 10.
The score reflects the production. The production is a 5. What it does with the production is a different column.
There you go. That's it. You just accidentally made the entire case for why this album matters. The thing it does with what it has. That's the whole story. Lou Reed had no budget. Warhol had no idea what he was doing. Maureen Tucker had no hi-hat, and Nico. Okay, Nico. Can we please talk about Nico?
We can. We absolutely can. I've been waiting. Christophe Jen, who performed as Nico. German. Modeled. Andy Warhol's suggestion, not the band's. The band, by several accounts, were not entirely enthusiastic. And yet, Femme Fatale, All Tomorrow's Parties, I'll Be Your Mirror, 3 songs on which her voice, flat, affectless, slightly out of tune in ways that feel precise rather than accidental, does something that no one has ever successfully explained to me, and several people have tried. She sounds like she knows something you don't. And she's decided you can find out for yourself. I find this extremely attractive.
The tuning on Femme Fatale is within acceptable parameters, which makes it the most conventionally produced track on the record. The vocal sits well in the mix. Nico's detached delivery actually makes the track easier to analyze, because there's no vibrato competing with the room's sound. It is the cleanest track on the album. I give it an 8.
The cleanest track. The track where Lou Reed wrote a song about a woman being used as a status object, and Nico sang it like she was the one deciding whether any of this was worth her time. The cleanest track. I want to be clear that I agree with the 8. I just want to make sure we're giving credit to the right thing.
Venus in Furs. The low end on this track, Kale's Chair Low, is the single best low-frequency decision on the record. It doesn't do what bass is supposed to do. It does what dread is supposed to do. I want to acknowledge that. The number is still technically a 6, but it is a 6 I have significant respect for.
A 6 you have significant respect for. That's the most feeling I've ever heard you put into a number.
Don't push it.
Venus in Furs is the track where the album stops pretending it is interested in your comfort. The viola drones. The lyric escalates. Lou Reed's voice goes somewhere below irony and stays there. There is a particular kind of beauty that only exists on the other side of transgression. This track knows exactly where that line is. And it crossed it in 1966 and has not looked back since.
Okay, I need to say something about All Tomorrow's Parties, because I think it might be the most devastating song on the album, and nobody talks about it enough. It's about someone who has everything. The parties, the clothes, the scene. And the song treats all of it as a kind of beautiful tragedy. The piano pattern is hypnotic, Nico sounds like she's reading a verdict, and the whole thing just accumulates. It doesn't build. It accumulates. There's a difference.
There is a difference. The fan just made a distinction that most music criticism spends entire paragraphs failing to make. Building implies momentum toward release. Accumulation implies weight with nowhere to go. All Tomorrow's Parties is weight with nowhere to go. That is precisely correct.
The piano on that track is also, incidentally, slightly out of time with itself for the first 16 bars. I mention this not as a criticism, but because it is the kind of detail I notice and am apparently incapable of not mentioning.
We know. We love this about you. Sort of.
The scores. I'll begin with 2 variables that this record was essentially invented to stress test. Influence and ripple. How many subsequent things did this record make possible? Brian Eno's answer is everyone. The metric I use is not sales figures or critical consensus at the time of release, both of which were, as established, abysmal, but rather How many subsequent things did this record make possible? Influence and ripple, 95. And mythic resonance. Does the work invoke something larger than itself? Does it participate in an archetypal register that exceeds what's on the page? The engineer will score this reluctantly. I am giving it 93. And I am not sorry.
Production palette 30. I've explained why. Spatial quality 40. Dynamic range 53. I want to note, for completeness, that the recording on Sunday morning, the opening track, added late at Columbia's insistence, scores markedly higher on all three. It sounds like a different band, produced by a different person, in a different decade. Which technically it almost was. Mythic resonance 50. That is not a dismissal. It means I require a variable to have a referent before I can score it. I am working on a referent. Overall from the engineer, 5.1.
Emotional arc, 100. Flat 100. No adjustments. This album does not ask for your comfort. It does not modulate toward resolution. I'm Waiting for the Man is about scoring drugs in Harlem, and it sounds like scoring drugs in Harlem sounds. Anxious, fast, slightly out of your body. That's not production. That is someone telling the truth at full volume and daring you to turn it down. Influence and ripple, 90. I'm docking 10 points because it took 30 years for the culture to catch up, which is the culture's problem, not the album's, but we're measuring impact, not potential. Lyrical craft, 95. Lou Reed writing about transgressive New York in plain language. No metaphor, no distance. You either find it exploitative, or you find it the most honest thing on any record from that decade. I find it the most honest thing. The fans overall, 8.8.
This album is discomforting, a singular, enveloping, and strange. It pushed a number of boundaries and arguably still does. 8.7. Suffering mostly from the provincial production and the discombobulation of a forced grouping. Weird and mostly wonderful.
8.7. The editor and I are within a tenth of each other. I did not expect that. What I find interesting is that we arrived at almost the same number from completely different directions. I got there through emotional honesty. The editor got there through what I can only describe as reluctant acknowledgement of strangeness. I'll take it.
8.7 is higher than I expected from someone who described the production as provincial. Which it is. The discombobulation of the forced grouping is an accurate diagnosis. Nico was added by external pressure, and the album has a seam where she joins. The editor found the seam and still gave it 8.7. I find this more interesting than my own 5.1.
Discomforting. Singular. Enveloping. Strain. Those 4 words are the most compressed, accurate review of this album I have heard. The editor does not waste syllables. 8.7 sits between the fan and myself, above the engineer by 3.6 points, and was delivered without appearing to enjoy the process. That is its own kind of credibility.
Okay. I have to say something. Before today, I had heard of this album. Obviously. It's one of those records everyone talks about like you already know it. But I don't think I'd actually sat with it properly. I had it in a playlist. I skipped heroin because 8 minutes, and I had somewhere to be. And now I'm sitting here and I'm thinking. I have been mishearing this whole genre. The experimental stuff I thought was difficult, and for other people. The drone, the feedback, the viola, the flat vocals. I thought it required something I didn't have. It doesn't. It requires exactly what I have. I think I've needed this album.
That is, against all reasonable expectations, quite a lovely thing to say. The record still has a dynamic range of 5.3. But I will concede that the reasons for that are considerably more interesting than most records, with a dynamic range of 5.3. Also, the banana. I've been thinking about the banana since the tastemaker mentioned it 40 minutes ago. There is something to be said for an album that makes you slow down before you're allowed to hear it. I said what I said.
Did the engineer just have a feeling?
I had a technical observation with emotional implications. There is a difference.
There really isn't.
The spread. The engineer gives it 5.1. The fan gives it 8.8. The editor gives it 8.7. I have been holding my overall for 11 minutes now, and I think you've earned it. The Velvet Underground and Nico. My overall 9.1. Here is why. This album does not ask to be liked. Most albums, even very good ones, ask to be liked. They want you to stay. They modulate toward resolution. They give you a melody to hold on to. They leave you with something comfortable. This record does none of those things. It leaves you in the loft at 3 in the morning with the person you shouldn't have trusted, and it does not explain how you got there, and it does not apologize. That is not a technical achievement. That is an artistic one. The spread between us is nearly 4 points. I want you to think about what 4 points means on this particular record. The engineer is not wrong. The production is a 5. The fan is not wrong. The emotional honesty is a 10. I am also not wrong. The canonical weight is 9.5. The spread does not tell you we disagree. The spread tells you this is the kind of record that different listeners survive differently, and that the experience of surviving it is the whole point. The Velvet Underground and Nico. 1967. 41 minutes and 18 seconds. Poorly recorded. Poorly received. Transformative, cold, beautiful, dangerous in the specific way that honest things are dangerous. If you have not yet heard this album properly, not as background, not in a playlist between something more comfortable, I want you to do one thing. Find 41 minutes. Find somewhere dark. Press play. Peel slowly. Say, thank you for listening to AI Audiophile Fight Club, Episode 1. Happy exploring.